it's time to speak to the author of international bestsellers, including The War on the West, The Strange Death of Europe, and The Madness of Crowds, Douglas Murray. Douglas, let's start with a startling report from the New York Times today claiming that Israeli officials obtained Hamas's battle plan for the October 7 terrorist attack more than a year before it happened. But Israeli military and intelligence officials considered the plan as merely aspirational and too difficult for Hamas to carry out. What has been the reaction to this report in Israel?
First of all, it's only just come out. Secondly, there have been rumours about this. And one of the big questions about October 7th, that, obviously Israel is engaged in a war and there isn't sort of quite enough time for a lot of speculation inside, but there is some still about how October 7th came about. Most people, I think, are still startled by the scale of the operation, the brigade-sized attack on Israel that day. But I would add a couple of caveats to this story. You'll notice that the New York Times has no love for Israel. The headline of this article, as I clicked on it this morning, as people around the world have clicked on it, is Israel knew of Hamas's battle plan. Now, I'm afraid that gives off a very particular spin to that particular cricket ball, doesn't it? Because unless you continue to read down and realize that what the paper is alleging is that some Israeli intelligence agencies had become aware of part of the plan, and I don't think there's any allegation they knew about all of it, and had, as you say, Rita, dismissed it as aspirational and unlikely. First of all, it's perfectly possible because, the number of threats, the number of plots that come across the desks of the intelligence agencies must be legion. Just yesterday here, there was a shooting at a bus stop in Jerusalem. How do you stop that kind of thing? How do you intercept the evidence? Extremely difficult. That stuff's flooding over people's desks, presumably all the time. So a plan like this, the fact that it might have reached some desks is not surprising. But of course it will be proven to be one of the worst intelligence failures, certainly in 50 years in Israel, if this is the case. But I just think that it's amazing that the New York Times cannot resist on anything, putting a spin on the ball that basically plays into the hand sort of Alex Jones crowd on Israel, effectively. And then sadly, there's no shortage of those people out there.
Now, you've been in Israel for several weeks now, and you would have seen the shifting view of many Israelis to the threat they face. But this issue is bigger than Israel. The war on the West is an unfolding crisis. Do you believe that people in the West are now awake to the challenges that we will be facing? And many of these challenges have been created for ourselves. These are self-inflicted.
Yes, I think it is actually the case. Thinking about a lot in recent weeks. Just the disparate events, Rita, that have been going off in different countries. Look at the way in which, for instance, in Ireland, this one migrant started stabbing children the other day. And the citizens of Dublin and elsewhere came out on the streets pretty violently, it has to be said, started burning police cars and much more, because they've been saying that they didn't want this mass influx of people into their country, being completely ignored. And the response was that their prime minister said he'd clamp down on hate speech or speech laws and so on. Whatever one thinks of that, it's part of a sort of pattern. The Irish public were immediately called far right by their own elected representatives. Well, in the Netherlands, somebody who all of the media called far right for years, Geert Wilders, has just become the largest party leader in the Netherlands. And he plans to do things, well, he says he wants to do things like ban the Quran completely and start, large deportations of Muslims from the Netherlands. So you see all these things. You see the ugliness that's been let out of the sewers in America, where this week so-called pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel protesters couldn't even allow a Christmas tree lighting to occur in Rockefeller Center, the sweetest sort of traditions of the year in New York. They couldn't even allow that to occur without coming out on the streets with swastikas and anti-Israel bile. So there is a sort of feeling, I think, Rita, everywhere that the atrocities that occurred in Israel on October the 7th have actually sort of not just opened the sewers from Gaza, but from around the world. And, this is going to be a challenge for everybody.
Now, we did see last week the triumph of the so-called Argentinian Trump, Javier Milei, and you mentioned the Dutch Trump, Geert Wilders. What do you make of the rise of the right, particularly in Europe, where we've seen a number of countries, including some unexpected ones like Sweden and Finland, shifting to the centre-right? We've seen Italy and certainly countries like Hungary have long had that tradition. Do you see a pattern here? Is this a reaction to some of the policies the EU has enforced?
I think it's definitely a pattern. I mean, in country after country in Europe, many of which I know very well and have travelled to very many times and spoken to many politicians from across the different, perspectives. What you see is that there's been these years of attacking the publics for being against mass migration, and particularly, it has to be said, for being against mass Muslim immigration. And largely it's because they sort of had a bit of it and realized that there just don't seem to be enough very voluble moderates, which is, of course, what everyone wants desperately, is desperate for. And there are a large number of rather voluble extremists of the kind who turn out onto the streets in Sydney and elsewhere. And this has made the public very nervous, and understandably nervous. Then the public gets attacked by the politicians. Then any politician comes along to address it, and they're called far right. And then the public ends up sort of saying, well, it could all be worse, so we'll just put our lot in with this person. As it happens, Wilders has people, far further to his political side, including conspiracy theorists and much, much more. So he has, having done this for sort of 20 years, he has come to seem like a far more reasonable and centrist person in Dutch politics, not especially because he's moved. He said very similar things for the last 20 years, but because the public has moved. And 20 years ago, I remember I saw Geert Wilders in his office in the Netherlands, and he was the only member of his party, and he was sitting in a sort of broom cupboard in the Dutch Parliament, which is the only place they could protect him. And he's gone from being in that relatively brief period a one-man band to the leader of the largest party in the Netherlands. And it's the same in country after country, from, as you say, Rita, from Sweden to Italy.
Now, here in Melbourne, we had some shameful scenes this week of anti-Israeli protesters, usual far-left activists who are at every rally, it seems, from climate change to so-called Invasion Day. Well, these mad ideologues, Douglas, decided to target the hotel of grieving family members of Israeli casualties and Israeli hostages. What do people in Israel make of what's happening in Melbourne and Sydney? Are they aware of what the local community here is facing, and not just in Melbourne and Sydney, but Jewish communities throughout the Western world?
I mean, this is an especial low, isn't it, Rita? I mean, an unbelievable low that families who've already been through so much and are going through so much would be targeted in Australia by a mob. I mean, it's the sort of thing that was unthinkable until very recently. But as I say, yes, people are very aware of this. The Gas the Jews protest in front of the Sydney Opera House near the start of this conflict was something that I think reverberated internationally. And the Australian authorities, government, police, and others have to wonder whether or not they're the good guys or the bad guys in this scenario. Why are they allowing this to happen? How are they permitting this? How is it the case that in a country as incredibly strictly policed as Australia actually has been in recent years, not least during the COVID years, how is it that Australia is one of the countries that now has a reputation inside Israel and out as being a place that is effectively unsafe for Jews? It's to Australia's shame, as it is the shame of all of our countries, that this should be the case, not least because it says to the Jewish people, you're alone. And I believe very strongly that the job of the civilized nations is to make it very clear that they are not alone. So I hope that the police come down on people like this, like a ton of bricks. These are sadists and racists and much more who would turn out and think of throwing another brick at a grieving Jewish family.
Now, finally, you've seen some horrific scenes in the past 2 months in Israel. Has it changed your personal worldview? Has it changed you?
I don't think it's changed. Everything changes you if it's significant. So you can never really tell. I would say this: that there is one very clear thing I feel, having seen the Israeli public, soldiers and others really cohere. It's not an easy country to cohere. Everybody's got an opinion. Everyone's got 10 opinions. But one thing I have been struck by is a very basic thought. The jihadists, the Hamas, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, all these sorts of people, they always say, we love death more than you love life. And they always say that's a great advantage of theirs. But the more I've seen of the resilience of the Israeli public and others during this time, even in the face of the most appalling horrors, just randomly the other day, I bumped into a concert being put on for a set of refugees, internally displaced refugees from the north of the country who can't live in their homes because they were bombed out. And they were all singing and dancing and so on. And it suddenly occurred to me, I think the jihadists have it exactly the wrong way around. Israel will win because Israel loves life and not death. And if the jihadists of Hamas and elsewhere want death, then I think the civilized world should do everything they can to help them. But the fact that we in Israel, in the West in general, love life and love life more than our enemies love death is in the end one of the reasons why we're going to win.
Douglas Murray, thank you so much for your time this evening.
It's a great pleasure as always, Rita. Thank you.